Right, well, my clock says 7 o'clock, so I'm going to get us started here this evening. So thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. We're going to have Aramee Diethelm talking to us about monarch butterflies this evening. So we're branching out a little bit from our typical subject matter here at the Bird Observatory. Tonight's presentation will be recorded, so it will be available on YouTube for later viewing, so you all are aware of that. We're going to hold all questions until the end of Aramee's presentation. You can type those into the chat feature or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen there with all your other Zoom controls. We've got a few, this is part of our January lecture series. So each Wednesday in January and the first one in February, we'll be doing these webinars. So tonight will be Aramee on monarch butterflies. Next Wednesday, we'll have Jen Hepner talking about house wrens. And the following Wednesday, I will be giving a rundown of the review species that the Nevada Birds Record Committee endorsed in 2021. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Aramee. She's got some really fascinating research to talk to us about tonight. She's with UNR's Evolution and Ecology Conservation Biology program. I think I got all those letters in that acronym right. But so I'm going to go ahead and turn myself off and hand this over to Aramee. So thanks again, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the show tonight.
Hi. So as Ned said, my name is Aramee, and I am here from the University of Nevada, Reno. Today I'm going to be talking about Western monarch butterflies. So starting with their natural history and then getting into a little bit about the work I've done to try to help with conservation efforts. So North American monarchs are known for their long distance, multi-generational migration. Today, we're going to be focusing on the Western monarch population, or those that breed west of the Rocky Mountains and primarily overwinter along the coast of California. And I say primarily because monarchs in Arizona are actually variable. So they will overwinter in the direction that the winds are most favorable. So they go to both California as well as down to Mexico. And it's also likely that we do get some spillover from the Eastern population because currently no one has found any genetic difference between the East and the Western monarch population, which does suggest that there's some sort of interbreeding going on. So it's not just one single monarch that makes the entire migration route, and the distances traveled between generations are actually quite variable. So the overwintering individuals, they spend November to February along the California coast. Oh, wrong way, sorry about that. Okay, before then dispersing into Central California. So they leave the overwintering sites, they head into Central California, and then that's where they lay eggs, and then that'll produce the next generation. So this next generation, they then keep expanding out across the West. So these monarchs actually live only 2 to 5 weeks, and they do travel. It's mostly in search of mates or food, as well as egg laying locations. So then they will produce another generation that just keep expanding out across the West. However, in late fall, something kind of amazing happens where caterpillars start getting these cues from shortening day lengths and then also from variant ambient temperatures, so sort of the difference between day and night. And then also the age of the plants that they're eating also acts as a cue. And so these caterpillars will actually emerge as adults that have longer, wider wings. So these wings are better for sustained gliding. So then this last fall generation, it is then the individuals that head all the way back to the overwintering sites. So in general, these monarchs will travel about 30 to 50 miles per day, although the farthest ranging monarch has actually been recorded flying 265 miles in one day. But then these are the same individuals then that will stay at the overwintering site, disperse in February, and start heading back out to lay eggs. So unfortunately, the Western population has experienced a really dramatic decline. So the numbers that you're seeing here, these were generated by annual overwintering counts that are done by the Cersei Society for Invertebrate Conservation. So these surveys have been going on since 1997. Then in 2018 and 2019, there was just this drop where populations got down to about 1% of the historical level. And then somehow in 2020, it was even worse. So that year it actually fell to about 0.01% of the historic population numbers, reaching an all-time low of just under 2,000 butterflies, which is actually under this extinction threshold that was proposed by several researchers out of WSU in Vancouver, Washington. And then recent work has shown that habitat loss, increased pesticide use, and climate change have all really contributed to these declines. So monarchs are milkweed specialists, which mean that they kind of exclusively lay their eggs on milkweeds. In general, the females will deposit 1 egg per plant, and they tend to put them on the underside of leaves. And then over 5 studies have actually shown that females prefer sort of low density milkweed patches, which is pretty interesting. So milkweeds produce these toxic compounds. So they're in this class called cardenolides, and they disrupt the sodium channels in your cells. So what you really need to know is that they're toxic, and pretty much all living things are impacted by these chemicals. So monarchs have a resistance to this toxicity that allows them to eat milkweeds with only minor effects. And the caterpillars will then sequester these toxins. And it's not a passive sequestration. It's actually, they can actively sequester it to be more toxic than the plant they're eating, which is pretty incredible. And then the adults do retain these chemicals. And so the coloration that you see for the stripes on the caterpillar and then the bright orange on the adult, those are like warning colorations, letting predators know that they are toxic. However, there's another aspect of milkweed chemistry that receives a lot less attention. So these compounds, they basically act like a sunscreen. So they're UV protectant. They're in a class called flavanol glycosides or flavonoids. And they're actually fairly common in many, they make the health benefits in wine and tea, so beverages that you might already enjoy. And then female monarchs, they actually use both the cardenolides, the toxic compounds, and then these sunscreen flavonoid compounds. They use those as cues to help locate their host plants or egg laying preferences. In northern Nevada, these are the 5 most common milkweeds. So there's actually 37 species of milkweeds across the West and 72 in the entire United States, if you don't count subspecies. And I bring this up because monarch conservation efforts, they were really initially focused on just increasing the abundance of milkweed. So despite this push to plant milkweed, there's really been very little focus on which species of milkweed best support Western monarch recovery. So host plant identity is important to caterpillars because these plants have differing traits that will affect developmental timing and survival. So the 2 most widespread species in the West and the 2 that are most likely to be used for habitat restoration are narrowleaf and showy milkweed. So as you might imagine, narrowleaf has very narrow leaves, while showy has these large, wide leaves. So these species, they have shared plant defenses, but they vary in the level of those traits. So showy milkweed produces far more of this kind of gooey, gummy latex substance. And they also produce far more of these leaf hairs or trichomes. So monarchs do have behavioral cheats in how they eat the milkweed to get around these defenses. So early caterpillars, they will sort of scrape away at the plant in these layers. And this creates kind of a horseshoe or a circular pattern. So latex is in the plant tissue in these pressurized cells. So by sort of scraping away layers, it's like the monarchs springing the trap, right? So the latex comes out and then they can safely eat in that area inside the circle or the horseshoe. And then older or later caterpillars, they will actually cut this like mid vein. That's another major source of latex in the leaves. They will cut it at around where the leaf meets the plant. And so that reduces the latex flow. And they also just seem to be a little bit better able to handle latex. And so they just eat big chunks out of the leaves. So if you're ever out looking around at your milkweed and you see these little horseshoes or those windows, you can guess that a monarch has indeed been there and even get at the age of the monarch. Okay, so despite their coloration and being toxic, there are organisms that do eat monarchs, although the blue jay is not one of them. So this is sort of an iconic photo series. It's commonly known as the barfing blue jay series. So birds in this study, they tended to regurgitate monarchs about 12 minutes after eating them. This study was from the late Dr. Brower, and it's really commonly taught in most beginning biology courses, and it's used to highlight the warning colors that different animals will use. But that being said, there are birds that do enjoy their monarchs. So birds such as the black-backed oriole and the black-headed grosbeak, they're actually really common predators eating thousands of milkweeds at overwintering sites in Mexico. So this pertains more to our Arizona milkweeds than our Western monarchs, but it is super interesting. So researchers recently looked at the oriole's DNA, and they found that the oriole is also resistant to those toxic compounds found in milkweed. And what's super cool is they actually have a really similar mutation in their DNA as monarchs do that make them resistant to the toxic cardenolides. So the oriole has not been fully sequenced, its DNA, so we don't know yet if it's fully resistant or not. But we do know there are birds across the West that do actually eat monarchs. They just have a behavioral adaptation. So they eat the less toxic part of the monarchs. So in general, the wings and then the outer cuticle of the monarch body, that's where those cardenolides are concentrated. So these birds do get around that by just selectively eating. So as you can see, there are jays in the West that will eat monarchs. And then in the last 20 years, there's really been just a major increase in observational studies, but just for the Eastern monarchs. So quite to many people's surprise, there's a wide variety of arthropods that will happily eat monarch caterpillars. And there's been some research to show that host plant identity, or which milkweeds those monarchs are eating, will affect the predator's behavior. So for example, in laboratory trials, yellow jackets, as you can see here, they had a preference for monarch caterpillars that were reared on the less toxic milkweeds than those on the highly toxic milkweeds. So most of this work has been done in the East. In the West, we have different milkweeds with different plant traits, and we also have different communities of predators, which brought me to one of the things that I have been researching. So I've been very interested in addressing how milkweed species impact monarch survival. So on your right there, you can see a jumping spider that is actually eating a monarch caterpillar. That's from one of my experiments. Okay, so just to back up and remind you what I mean by host plant identity. So for this presentation, we're going to focus on those two most widespread species of milkweed. And I just want to remind you that they differ in the amount of latex they produce, the density of their leaf hairs, and the toxicity of the cardinalides that they contain. So Showy is actually marginally more toxic than narrowleaf is. So to get at a hypothesis, I really could have went with either one of the plants being better for monarchs. So we know that more toxic caterpillars, they tend to, or predators tend to avoid them. But we also know that these plant defenses, they do prolong how long it takes the caterpillar to develop. But I picked narrowleaf. So because the chemistry is only marginally different, but the plant traits are substantially different, my prediction was that monarchs would survive better on narrowleaf. To get at this question, I planted milkweeds into a common garden. So this common garden environment allows me to rule out any environmental differences for plant chemistry as well as caterpillar survival. I put out about 175 monarch caterpillars with lots of help, including people here who graciously gave me their time. And then I established sort of two treatment levels. So there were these cages that excluded predators, and this sort of gave me an idea of a baseline for survival or how many caterpillars might be just passing away from disease, essentially. So these are what the treatments look like. So the caterpillars that are exposed to predators, they were in open-sided cages, so a control for my control, essentially. They were checked daily when possible for survival, and we would just comb through the plants looking for the caterpillars. So while we were doing that, we also noted any predatory arthropods that were on the plants. And then the full cages, those were checked periodically to see if we'd actually removed all the predators, and then also to get at sort of developmental rate differences that could be happening. And then we only check them periodically because it is unbelievably hard to get these cages buried in the ground, which you do have to bury them to keep predators out and keep the monarchs in. Okay, so these are the results from 1 year of the study. So the study was actually conducted over 3 years. And then I did expand it to further sites, but I'm still combing through that data. So more results yet to be presented. But if we look at 1 year, okay, so this is a survival probability curve. So you can see the probability of survival over time. So time is on your x-axis, and the treatments that were caterpillars on narrowleaf, you can see in blue. The caterpillars on Showy are in green. And as you can see, as we move through time, the probability of survival reduces, although that reduction is not the same for all treatments. So if we first look at those top two lines, so those are our cages or the caterpillars that were protected from predators. So the kind of highlighted area around the lines, that's just showing you how much variance there was in the data that was collected. So it's like a confidence interval. But even with this variance, you can see there are differences between the species. So survival in the wild, right? It's about 5 to 10% of the eggs laid actually reach adulthood. So here we had upwards of 80% of our caterpillars surviving. However, our two bottom lines are the caterpillars that were exposed to predators. So again, blue being your narrow leaf and green being showy. And you can see it's about in line what you see in the wild, so 9%, 7%. But let's zoom in a little. So despite there being a large difference between those exposed to predators and those not, you can see that for both those treatments, narrow leaf is kind of winning, right? So caterpillars reared on narrow leaf, they're doing better regardless of exposure to predators. So this gets at sort of some of those plant trait issues that I was bringing up, dealing with the latex and the trichomes. Okay, so this study actually mirrored another study that was done in Davis, California, looking at showy and narrow leaf and showing that monarchs that are exposed to predators tend to do better on narrow leaf. It's a little bit surprising because if you look at the leaves, like especially on this plant, narrow leaf's very narrow. It's hard to imagine a caterpillar hiding in this plant, as opposed to showy, which has these huge leaves that the caterpillars could be hiding under. So a couple of things to keep in mind is that we do know that predators will search through plants using visual cues that aren't just the caterpillar. So they will look for the caterpillar boop, or as entomologists call it, frass. They also will look for plant damage, and then plants also put out these sort of alarm calls trying to attract predators. So there's several different cues besides just seeing the caterpillar that predators are picking up on. Okay, and so I would say that we want to kind of look at these results with some caveats. So there have been a couple studies looking at female preference for milkweeds. So narrow leaf has been included in those studies. Again, it's on eastern monarchs. It tends to be with eastern milkweeds, and then they will put narrow leaf in there, I guess, for fun. But in general, in these lab trials, females tend to not want to use narrow leaf when they have access to several other milkweed plants. But that being said, some preliminary work coming out of the Pringle lab has shown that those sunscreen or UV protectant chemicals that milkweed produces, so monarchs use those as cues, and we know that drought is sort of increasing them, particularly in narrow leaf. So it's possible that those preferences that we're seeing could be altered with climate change and increased drought across the West. And then another caveat is that it's likely that pesticides would also influence female preference, as well as the survival of caterpillars. So unfortunately, a recent study tested about 250 different samples from Central California, done by some colleagues at UNR and other universities. But they looked at 19 different sites across different habitat types. And at every single site, they found pesticides on the milkweeds that they tested. And these were sites where there were wildlife refuges that had never applied those particular pesticides. There were homeowners who had never applied pesticides. And then there were also plants that were tested from some of the larger stores selling milkweeds, and those milkweeds all tested for pesticides. So they're out there, and they're probably everywhere, particularly the water-soluble ones. But another study looked at how the pesticides contamination in plants, how that influenced female preference. And so females did kind of marginally prefer non-contaminated plants. And then also caterpillars eating contaminated plants, they actually ate less, which the younger caterpillars, they don't really move a lot between plants. They do when they get older, but it means that probably those caterpillars are going to be smaller. They're going to just have to eventually turn into an adult at a smaller caterpillar size. So. All right, so hopefully I haven't thoroughly depressed you, but there are some opportunities that you, as an everyday citizen, could contribute to science and to monarch conservation. So I use the Xerces Society. They have this database. It's called the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. And I've used that a lot for a lot of population studies I've done for milkweeds across the West. And so you can actually report milkweed patches there, which is very helpful. It helps to prioritize areas for conservation. And then you can also report any of your monarch sightings. So if you do see eggs, caterpillars, adults, this is a great resource if you're in the West. They do, however, require a picture. So if you're out and about, try to get a picture of the monarch if you can. And then another thing you could do is just trying to eat organic and reducing pesticide use in your own yard. So we don't have a lot of control over what our neighbors are doing, but we can make these changes to try to reduce how much pesticides are in the landscape. Another wonderful thing you could do is to plant native flowers in your yard that provide food resources during times when there's not a lot for monarchs and other pollinators. So early spring blooming plants, late fall blooming plants such as asters, they're really a great resource for monarchs and other invertebrates. I've seen lots of hummingbirds nectaring on milkweed, so that's also beneficial. And so what unfortunately hurts is two things I would say to avoid is rearing groups of caterpillars indoors. I think if you're rearing caterpillars for outreach, that's great. But if you're rearing them to help the Western population, you're not really getting at those key issues, right? So our key issues are habitat loss, pesticide use, and climate change, right? So you're not really reducing those key drivers. And what's sort of worse, so monarchs have really adapted to just being one caterpillar on one plant, right? So the female puts one egg on one plant for the most part. So they don't have a lot of disease resistance. There are other caterpillars that there are lots of them and they have much more disease resistance built into them. So group rearing can really spread disease and then you're releasing those diseased individuals into the wild. So I would really say that's not what you should do. And then the other sort of controversial thing that people do, so with that push for milkweed, a lot of people started planting tropical milkweed in their yards. And the problem with tropical milkweed is that it doesn't die back the way that our native milkweeds do. And so it'll continue growing. And so that kind of gets at a couple things. So it's sort of reducing those cues that I was talking about that the larvae used for knowing when to be the migration generation. And then also because they don't die back, they become sort of this reservoir for parasites. So monarchs do have parasites. There's about 30% of the wild monarchs in the West have a very particular protozoan parasite. And this is one that can just multiply and it can live on that tropical milkweed all year round. So definitely if you do have tropical milkweed, cut it back in the fall. And then if you are going to purchase native plants from a nursery, just ask them if they use any kind of pesticide. So they don't advertise that openly, but they will tell you if you ask. So that's another really great resource for trying to reduce pesticide contamination. Okay, I'm apparently very speedy. So that is my talk. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Aramee. That was really interesting, and I certainly have questions. We were talking about some interesting stuff before I started about some of the population information, and I thought that was really interesting how you got at that. But before I ask mine, we have a question from Ben Sonnenberg in the Q&A here, wondering about physiological differences between the long-lived monarchs versus the individuals that live more along the 2 to 5 week lifespan.
Great. So that's a great question. So they actually go into reproductive diapause, which is a very fancy way of saying that they turn off their reproductive organs. So those caterpillars, they look exactly the same as other caterpillars. They pupate, and then they emerge as these large adult monarchs who have their reproductive organs are not active. And then it's possible that that is one of the main reasons why they can live longer, but that's the only real physiological difference that we know of.
Cool. Katie is asking, what has surprised you the most about your research thus far?
So while out in these predator gardens, I was actually pretty surprised by, there are these yellow jackets that, okay, so they seem to know where the monarchs used to be. So once the monarchs got really close to pupating, I would bring them into the greenhouse, let them just kind of pupate in there so that I could weigh them as soon as they kind of hardened off. And so I would collect these monarchs, I would take them inside, and then I would go back out and I'm still checking the other plants, still have active monarchs. And incredibly, these yellow jackets would roam around at the plants where I had just opened the cages, collected the caterpillars, and they would crawl all over that whole plant and then fly over to the next one where I had just taken a monarch off and crawl over all over that plant. So passing over the plants that hadn't had monarchs either in weeks or possibly never. So I thought that was pretty amazing because I don't know what queue that is, but it's pretty great.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was just going to ask if you had any suspicions of what they might be queuing in on there. That's bizarre. Well, we've got another question from Ben, wondering if you have any comments on the populations of milkweed in Nevada, and what's the most populous species and the most important local species to Reno for monarchs.
Yeah, so let's get this to go backwards. There we go. So I think most people think there's kind of one species of milkweed. It's kind of amazing that we have, 37 in the West. Speciosa, Showy, and then Precarious narrowleaf. Those are the two most widespread. So they're habitat generalists. They can kind of grow anywhere and you will see them everywhere. And then these are the plants that unfortunately farmers kind of hate them. So because they are toxic, if you have extremely hungry cattle, they will meander over and eat this milkweed plant. And it has been known to kill cattle before, but you have to be a very hungry cow at that point. But so we do see farmers often burning these on the sides of the irrigation ditches, like particularly out in Fallon. But then we have these very cool habitat specialists. So Cryptoceros up here, this grows on really steep, kind of sandy clay slopes. So it makes this long anchor root and just kind of hangs on. I've seen them slide down and with the soil and do just fine, but they are the early bloomers. So across Northern Nevada, this is going to be our spring resource for any early migrating monarchs. So even though there's multiple generations that are moving, we still call them migrating as they go through their, kind of breeding expansion, as it's called. So that's a really good early source. And then a Rosa or desert milkweed. This is pretty incredible. It looks a lot like Showy, but it grows only in incredibly dry areas. So it doesn't make sense that it has these wide, fat leaves that would just cause evapotranspiration, water loss, but they do well, but they're the late bloomers. So what's great about them is they provide these like late nectar resources, and then any fall contracting migrating monarchs, this is good for them. And then not to leave out cordifolia, it's just super pretty. So it's got like kind of heart-shaped leaves. It does produce a ton of nectar also. It's a really good resource for ants.
So it sounds like they're all important at different times, sort of depending on the timing of migrants. So it might be
Yes.
kind of hard to overall say what the most important species might be.
I mean, I think I'm kind of biased and I want to say it's narrowly based on my research. More work should be done.
All right, well, thanks. Elizabeth Pringle is noting how interesting it is that some of the bird predators of monarchs have evolved to resist some of these milkweed toxins. And she's wondering about your thoughts on some of the arthropod predators and if some of them may also have developed some of these adaptations.
Yeah, so that is a great question. So there's actually a very tiny wasp, and it is like an egg predator of monarchs, essentially. And it also has those same, the exact same mutations that the grosbeak does. I believe it's two of the three same mutations as what the monarch has. So it is across. It's crazy. It's across multiple taxonomic groups. There's also a root predator. So there are these tiny invertebrates that live in the soil and they eat milkweed roots. And they actually have the same mutation as well. So I feel like the more genomic studies we have, we're definitely going to find that there are way more animals that are able to eat milkweed and monarchs.
So fascinating. We have someone here. I'm thinking you might have paid this person to make this point, but
Yep.
Adrian, I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name. I'm sorry. How can this plant have so many different defensive traits? Latex, phenolic glycosides, cardinalides. Oh my. Maybe you have some more comments on that.
Yes, her check's in the mail. Yeah, so it's kind of it's weird how different the milkweeds really can be. So the first thing that comes to mind is sort of this, whether there's like a trade-off in the cost that it takes to produce these compounds, and then whether there are just evolutionary constraints for the different species of milkweed. So there is one particular researcher from Cornell who has looked at sort of the evolutionary history of milkweeds. And so over time, it appears that milkweeds are moving away from their toxins and moving away from sort of that like toxic resistance to sort of just accepting their fate that they are going to be eaten by monarchs. And so they're actually moving more towards having like excessive growth. So sort of trying to like outgrow the caterpillar that's eating them. Yeah, and then it's just crazy how much chemistry milkweeds have. So it's not just the toxins. The toxins get all the glory, but there's also those UV absorbing sunscreen chemicals, and then there's also these other chemicals they produce that appear to be appetite suppressants. So there's actually diet pills that humans take that are made from milkweed extractions that suppress appetite.
It's very fascinating. Well, I haven't seen any other questions come in, so I'd like to hear you talk more about those population numbers, because I think that's just really neat stuff, how they get those.
Yes. So actually made a couple extra slides. Let's get back to the end here. Oh, I see. I have them hidden. Sorry. Give me 1 second here. Okay. So in case you were thinking that maybe the monarch decline graphs are actually a result of sort of the input put into the surveys. So there's this semi-confusing graph, which is why I have this as an extra slide. So your green there, that's that same monarch decline that we saw earlier, monarch decline pattern. But the blue, that's how much, that's the effort. So that's how many people are out surveying essentially, right? So that's our number of sites monitored. And as you can see, that's actually increasing as these population numbers are decreasing. And so essentially what they do is they go out around Thanksgiving and they go early in the morning when it's still very cold. So monarchs cannot fly if it's under 55 degrees. So they're sort of clustered in these trees along the coast, and they do that for increased warmth. But so folks will go out before the monarchs can move and essentially count them in this location. So we know we're not double counting because they're not flying. And so basically they try to count as many sites along the coast as possible. And recently it's been a ton of sites. But we did have a really cool population explosion last year that people are still looking into. So, right, so historically there were millions of monarchs, and then we dropped down about to the 200,000s for a while, and then we really dipped down, and then somehow last year we got back up to about 200,000. So this is the year to go visit the overwintering sites if you have time.
Yeah, what was with that population spike? I mean, you threw around some crazy numbers earlier, and is that sort of anecdotal? Is that documented well? Are there known causes?
So the 200,000 for the count last year, which would be like somewhere around here, so just like a pretty big jump. It's sort of impossible that those, you know, the 2,000 monarchs in 2020, that those females then contributed to the next generation. So there's a couple things that people think. As I said earlier, we get that spillover from the East Coast. So if we had a lot more of that this year, that could help sort of, you know, bring our numbers up. But also last year, there was a very strange behavioral difference in the Bay Area. So normally when the monarchs are overwintering, they're, you know, in their reproductive diapause, they're hanging out on the coast in these trees. There was just a weird record number of monarchs in the Bay Area around San Francisco and Oakland that were actually still breeding and still laying eggs. And so it was like in the thousands. So that was pretty incredible. So it's possible that those monarchs also then contributed to those overwintering counts, right? So those would have been, I think those would have been in the spring of 2020. And then they could have then contributed to those generations that expand and then have that contraction.
And then also it just even more interesting, the fact that we had such dry conditions last year. And I think you mentioned, or at least alluded to, some of the arid adaptations of milkweed, and that could be playing in there as well. But that's, I think, pretty notable.
Yeah.
And I do see another couple questions here. Stacy Wilson is wondering if the eastern monarch decline is mirroring that of the western, or if there's a distinct difference in the numbers.
Yeah, so again, great question. But what's crazy is that so the eastern monarchs, they go all the way to Mexico, right? Like they're going way further. So the western monarchs, they kind of get up into like lower British Columbia, but the eastern monarchs, they go up into Canada, then they fly all the way from Canada down to Mexico. That's insane and seems a little bit harder. But for whatever reason, the eastern monarchs, their population decline was around 80% when the western monarchs were at 99. So yeah, for whatever reason, they seem to be doing better. And that actually did sort of hurt our chances of having the monarch listed. So the monarch was originally, it was petitioned to be listed as an endangered species by Lincoln Brower and others. The person that did that barfing blue jay study, but that was in 2014. It was it proposed to be listed, and then unfortunately recently the Fish and Wildlife just said, you know, being listed is warranted, but we don't have the happens. So, and part of that is because there's no genetic difference between Eastern and Western monarchs. So even though like, it's 99.9% decline, is devastating. When you consider the Eastern monarchs too, it's not as bad.
And do you suspect maybe different species of milkweed or different levels of milkweed availability, or I don't know, other possible conditions?
Yeah, so there, as farms become more consolidated from mom and pop farms, there was just sort of this loss of milkweeds in those habitat borders. And so initially everyone was like, oh no, we've lost the milkweed at the breeding sites. This is what's the problem. Like, oh no, we got to plant more milkweed. But looking at sort of historical records, so entomologists love to go out, capture bugs, pin them, and put them in museums. So we have all these sort of natural history museums that have these pin specimens. And so we can get a record of approximate numbers. So even this like really high, this first monarch count in 1997. So it's higher than the rest, right? Like you can see that's a lot larger, but sorry, it's a quick aside, but people did go through the records of monarchs being caught. And even when you account for the bias of people loving monarchs and probably netting more of them, these numbers are pretty accurate. But in addition to that study, they also looked at sort of monarch abundance and how it changed with the loss of milkweed. And so it looked like monarchs actually were declining pretty drastically before the milkweed started declining. So that's sort of one little piece of evidence that it's not necessarily the loss of milkweed across their breeding range. So it's possible that habitat connectivity is super important. And so it's not just the amount of milkweed, it's like specifically where the milkweed is found. And then also just there's been a lot of habitat destruction along the overwintering sites in California, unfortunately. So milkweed's not necessarily an important part of their overwintering. They need trees like large old trees that they can cluster in. And unfortunately, a lot of it's on private land and they trim the tree limbs at the wrong time, murdering monarchs or things, it gets developed and turns into condos. Yeah.
So I do see a couple other questions come in, but while we're on the population, I just have a hopefully quick. There's just that huge drop from, it looks like 97 to 98. And then was it 20 to 21 or 21 to 22 when we had that huge spike? Do we know of any significant like climate events or anything, that could have happened in both years, or the opposite happened in one situation versus the other?
So I don't know about any specific climate change, or just
significant storm, hurricane, big hurricane season. I don't know.
So what's crazy is that like all of the West was on fire between this like jump, right? So I wouldn't expect that the population would jump when a bunch of the West burned down, but so there was something significant that happened, but I don't see why it would be good for the butterflies. I mean, there are butterflies that like sort of fire damage. There's like checker spots. They like plants that are kind of weedy and come back after fires, but that's not monarchs.
There's just a lot we don't know.
Yes, there's a lot we don't know. We're trying to chip away at that.
So Adrienne asks if we know anything about milkweed root exudates, volatile or otherwise. So
other people do. I wouldn't say I know as much about it. So one thing that is interesting is that those toxic compounds, they are found in the roots of the milkweeds. So we know they're there. I don't know a lot about the volatiles though, unfortunately.
And maybe dumb that down a little for folks like me that don't know what a root exudate is.
Oh, sure. Well, Adrienne studies this, so it's so funny that this is her question. But roots will pump out things essentially. So they can put out these chemicals that will recruit what we call like natural enemies, and it's just a fancy word for predators or things that will, you know, eat the thing that's eating the milkweed root. So there's actually a very cute milkweed beetle that as an adult eats the milkweed leaves. Again, has those same mutations that allow it to just eat milkweed, no problem. But when they're in their juvenile phase, the beetles actually, they're down eating the roots of the plant. I guess plants also like put out carbon and other things to try to recruit sort of other beneficial animals.
Cool. And we have a question from Gary Cottle. I'm not sure if I'm saying that last name properly. Wondering about the monarch counts in November, if they're only along the coast, and if we count them in Nevada at a different time.
Yes, so they are only along the coast, and I think part of that is just, you know, consistency. You do it during the overwintering time when there's a bunch of monarchs in one spot. You get them there. They're not flying around if you go when it's cold enough. But there are other counting events. So there's this very cool location that's not in Nevada, but very close to Nevada. So if you know, I'm blanking on this now, but so south of the bristlecone pine forest in California, just close to the border of Nevada, there's actually this crazy desert area where for years there were monarchs that were sort of clustering there during kind of on their way, we think, to the overwintering sites. And there was just one naturalist. He was just out there every year from the 70s doing his own surveys every year, not telling anyone about it. He got really sick, decided that he should probably share this information, and gave all of his records to the, I think it's Fish and Wildlife. So now they have these annual counts down there. So it's Salinas Valley. It's really crazy because there's no milkweed. It's a desert. And there are just monarchs flying around. So myself and other members of the lab that I'm in have gone down there, and we saw like 25 monarchs total, but there used to be thousands. And then this last year, there was another count where there were 2,000 monarchs down there. So it's pretty great.
It sounds like some kind of a staging area or something, but we don't really know why they'd be staging there.
Yeah, there's like these canyons, and they have probably seasonal water sources, and, monarchs seem to stop over there for, weeks to a month at a time.
Interesting.
But I will also say, if you want to participate in any monarch counts, doing that Western monarch milkweed mapper, or if you're not in the West, there's I'm not remember now, but it's like the Monarch Larval Joint Venture, I think it's called. But you can submit that there too. And researchers like me, we use that data all the time. So it does really contribute.
Awesome.
Also, I'm biased and I want Nevada to be appreciated. So I tend to be on there all the time marking my sightings.
Awesome. Well, so I don't see any more questions coming in, and I think that might be a great note to end on, is sort of hammer home the things we can all do to help and get involved. I know you mentioned a bit of that during the show, but just emphasize what we can all do here at home to help folks like you learn more.
Oh yeah, definitely. Reporting your sightings. Oh yeah, so there it is, the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. That's another one. So Xerces Society, they also do this thing where you can get your yard, you can get it backyard certified, right? Like for birds from the Audubon. They have that for insects. So you can get your backyard certified as pollinator habitat, which is pretty great. And so essentially they teach you about monitoring, and you make a pledge to be pesticide free, and then you have to pay for this fancy sign, and it's just sort of a way to fund what they're doing. So Xerces Society is really just like kind of the major invertebrate conservation society, particularly in the West. And they do a great job of really getting out there and trying to get laws passed. And and then doing a lot for habitat restoration and then education too.
Awesome. Well, so we have no more questions, and I think that's a great note to end on. So again, thank you so much for speaking tonight. I learned a ton, and I really enjoyed hearing it.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for attending, everyone.
All right, well, with that, we're going to sign off for the evening, and I'll just quickly plug next week's talk, Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. We're going to have Jen Hepner talking about house wren nesting ecology on an urban gradient in the Reno area. She's also at the UNR EECB program. And so I hope you might all tune in next week. Thanks again, and have a good night, everyone.